If you've ever believed the Wild West was only about shootouts and gold rushes, you're in for a surprise. Today's tale is about a man who spoke little, a runaway girl who carried too many secrets, and a ranch that became more than just land. Stick around, and before we dive in, don't forget to hit that subscribe button, drop a like, and tell me in the comments, would you have trusted the rancher or run farther into the dark? Your thoughts make these stories come alive. The wind pushed grit across the Wyoming plains as the sun dropped behind the ridges, painting the horizon in rust and shadow. Eli Carter moved with the slow certainty of habit, carrying a bucket from the well to the trough. His broad shoulders carried the years without complaint, but the silence around him was heavier than the bucket. Men in town called him the mute rancher. It wasn't true, not exactly. He could speak, he just chose not to. Words had failed him the night his little girl died of fever and his wife disappeared soon after, and since then, he let the earth and cattle hear more from him than any person. His cabin stood plain against the land, its porch boards worn smooth. Inside, a guitar leaned against the wall, strings coated with dust. He hadn't touched it in years, though his hand still remembered the chords. Work filled his days, nights were for staring into the fire, letting memories crowd in until the flames burned low. He lived as if waiting for something that would never come. That something arrived one storm-bent evening. The wind howled through the cottonwoods and lightning tore the sky when Eli heard a sound not made by weather. He froze, listening, the scrape of a latch near the barn. Rifle in hand, he moved like a shadow through the mud, boots quiet, breath steady. He found her crouched by the feed bins, small and ragged, her hands trembling around a stolen heel of bread. She looked up, eyes wild under a mess of dark hair. 14, maybe 15, thin as wire. She didn't beg, didn't cry. She just stared, ready to bolt like a feral colt. "Please," she whispered. Her voice cracked, rough from thirst. Eli said nothing. He lowered the rifle but didn't move closer. The storm cracked again, and she flinched. He saw bruises along her arms, boots too large for her feet, a gash on her cheek. She held the bread as if he might rip it away. Instead, he tipped his head toward the cabin. She hesitated, then followed, as if she sensed the man in front of her wasn't the kind who'd strike a child. Inside, he set stew on the table. She devoured it, spoon clattering, eyes darting as though expecting punishment. He steadied her the way he might a new foal, skittish, half wild, all bones and mistrust. "What's your name?" His voice, low and unused, startled even himself. She blinked, swallowed hard. "Sarah." He nodded. Said nothing more. She waited, as if he might demand her story, but when no questions came, her shoulders eased. The silence between them became something steadier than her fear. That night he put her in the bunkhouse with a quilt. Rain hammered the roof while Eli sat by his fire, staring at the door as if expecting her to run. She didn't. By morning, she was out feeding his chickens, awkward in her movements but determined. Days lengthened into a rhythm. She patched fences with him, though she had to use both hands to lift a hammer. She laughed, sudden, bright, when a calf licked her hand, and Eli felt a jolt in his chest. He hadn't heard laughter under his roof in 10 years. He fixed her boots with scraps of leather, carved the soles so they fit. She found his guitar and plucked at the strings, coaxing faint notes that stirred long-buried ache. Still, shadows clung to her. At night she woke screaming, muffling the sound in her blanket. Once, while helping him with tack, she blurted half a truth. Her stepfather had wanted to trade her off, sell her to men she didn't name. She cut herself short, eyes sharp with shame and warning, and Eli didn't press. He only placed his hand on her shoulder, solid, steady, enough to say she wasn't alone. As the days passed, the girl's mistrust thinned, but Eli's heart grew heavier. Sarah's presence dragged up memories of his own daughter, golden-haired, feverish, gone before her 8th spring. The sight of Sarah brushing a colt or sitting on the porch steps with her chin in her hands twisted inside him, grief and hope tangled until he barely knew which was stronger. One evening, Sarah caught him sharpening his rifle on the porch. "You expect someone?" she asked. Eli glanced at the horizon. He'd heard whispers in town, men passing through asking after a runaway girl. Their questions carried weight, the kind of weight that drew guns behind it. "Maybe," he said, voice low. Sarah's spoon clattered against her bowl. Fear flickered across her face, raw and unguarded. Eli reached across the table, steadying her hand with his calloused fingers. He didn't promise her safety with words, he never had much use for them, but the look in his eyes told her enough. The night pressed in thick around the ranch, crickets falling silent. Eli sat awake, rifle across his knees, staring into the darkness beyond the fence line. For the first time in a decade, he felt something other than emptiness. The ache of loss was still there, but beneath it burned something harder, sharper, alive. Protectiveness. The storm that had carried Sarah to his ranch hadn't ended, it was only gathering. And Eli Carter, the silent rancher, would be ready when it broke. The first sign of trouble came when hoofbeats rattled through the town of Red Bluff, carrying with them dust and questions. 3 men in trail-worn coats, their eyes like gun barrels, dismounted outside the saloon and began asking about a runaway girl. Their words weren't loud, but the way they leaned close, the way their hands rested near holsters, spread the message clear as a bell: this girl wasn't theirs to lose. She was theirs to claim, and they intended to take her back. News traveled faster than stagecoaches in a town that small. By evening, Eli Carter heard from the storekeeper's boy that strangers were sniffing around. He said nothing, just paid for his sack of flour and rode out. His silence, as always, was heavier than talk. The boy watched him ride, sensing the storm gathering in the man's wake. Back on the ranch, Sarah noticed it immediately. Eli's movements were tighter, sharper, his eyes cutting to the tree line more often. When he handed her a revolver, small enough to sit in her hand, she stared at it as though it might bite. "I don't." "You learn," Eli said. His voice was steady, gravelly, leaving no room for refusal. And she did. Every day after chores, he drilled her. He showed her how to load, how to breathe, how to steady her hands until the barrel aligned with the post he set up on the fence. She hated the weight of the gun, but she hated the idea of being taken back more. Each squeeze of the trigger chipped away at her fear, leaving behind something harder. But Eli wasn't teaching her to fight for his sake. He knew what was coming, and the thought of Sarah facing it alone churned his stomach. She had survived things no child should face, he wouldn't let her go through more. He told himself he was only preparing her for the worst. The truth dug deeper, he wanted her to stay alive, even if he didn't. The outlaws came sooner than he'd hoped. Dusk had barely fallen when the dogs barked and shadows moved along the fence line. 5 riders this time, not 3, their horses restless, their laughter sharp as broken glass. Sarah's breath hitched. Eli crouched beside her in the barn, rifle balanced across his knee. His eyes, steady as granite, met hers. "You stay low. Do as I say." She nodded, knuckles white around the revolver. The riders spread out, circling. One shouted, "Carter. We know you got her. Send the girl out, and maybe we leave the house standing." Eli's silence was answer enough. He squeezed the trigger, and the first outlaw toppled from his saddle before his words had cooled in the night air. Horses screamed, gunfire erupted, and the ranch turned into a battlefield. Eli moved with the precision born of old scars. He knew the land better than any man alive, and he used it, ducking behind troughs, firing from the shadows of the barn, herding the outlaws toward the gullies and fences that hemmed them in. Each shot was deliberate, each step measured. The rancher who had once buried himself in silence now fought like a man rediscovering his purpose. Sarah, trembling, held her ground in the hayloft. When one outlaw crept toward the barn, she swallowed her terror, aimed as Eli had taught her, and fired. The man collapsed, cursing, clutching his shoulder. She dropped the revolver, shocked at the ringing in her ears, but when Eli glanced up at her, there was no reproach in his eyes. Only pride. The fight dragged bloody across the yard. By the time the last 2 outlaws fell, one dead and the other crawling, clutching his gut, the night was thick with smoke and the copper tang of blood. Sarah crept from the loft, wide-eyed, as Eli dragged the wounded man into the lamplight. "Who sent you?" Eli's voice cracked through the silence, more words than Sarah had ever heard him speak at once. The outlaw spat blood. "Man named Whitlock. Girl's stepfather. Said her mama owed him. Said she weren't his to keep but his to sell." His laugh was broken glass, bitter and thin. "Guess you didn't know, her mama wasn't the saint she claimed." Eli's grip tightened on the rifle, but he forced the man to keep talking. "She disappeared, years back. Sold the kid to cover her trail. Said the girl's real father would never come looking, not after all this time." His gaze flicked to Eli, mocking. "Guess that fool was you." The words hit like a bullet. Eli staggered, chest hollowing, mind racing back through years of loss. His wife, gone without a trace. The fever, the graves. The aching silence that had followed. And now this ragged girl, sitting in his barn with his eyes staring back at him. Sarah froze. "What is he saying?" Eli lowered the rifle slowly. He wanted to deny it, to spare her, but the truth burned too bright in his veins. He knelt, rough hands trembling as he reached for her shoulders. "Your mama, she was mine. And you," his throat closed, but he forced it open. "You're my daughter." Sarah's breath caught. For a long, terrible moment, she just stared at him, as though weighing whether to believe a word from a world that had only betrayed her. Then her chin wavered, and she collapsed into his chest. Eli wrapped his arms around her, crushing her against him, his silence broken not by words but by a sob he hadn't allowed himself in years. Behind them, the outlaw tried to rise, but Sarah pulled away, snatched the revolver from the ground, and leveled it. Her hands shook, but her aim was true. She didn't fire, she didn't need to. Eli finished it, clean and certain, and the man's laughter died in the dirt. The ranch yard grew quiet again, broken fences standing like grave markers in the moonlight. Sarah buried her face against Eli's shirt, and for the first time in a decade, his house felt less like a tomb and more like a home. When dawn came, Eli sat on the porch with Sarah beside him. The rifle leaned against the wall, but his hands cradled the guitar instead. He strummed a chord, voice low, rusty, but carrying. He sang a song his wife used to hum, the words carrying into the morning. Sarah listened, tears drying on her cheeks, and leaned against him. For the first time, she wasn't running. And for the first time, Eli Carter wasn't silent.